Hello and welcome. In the last couple of videos, we took a look at linear functions and quadratic functions, and we're going to be taking a look at other more interesting functions shortly as well. I just want to give you one basic application of where you may take some of these functions and have to use them in conjunction with each other and solve the equation. And that would be using supply and demand as a great example. So I want to go over some of the really basic concepts of supply and demand and finding the equilibrium points so that together in class then we can work on a few examples using that concept. So taking a look at the notes here, a couple of things that we can explain is thinking about a market for some sort of item and taking the perspective of the consumers versus the producers of that product. Okay, so we're going to start off by taking the perspective of the consumer, which is probably easiest for us because a lot of us already are the typical consumer. We can understand those concepts a little bit better. It may be best to think about this in terms of making a graph. And on that graph, it's convention to have the quantity of an item in a market along the x-axis. So this is the quantity of some good. And then along the vertical axis, representing price. And this could be for any product that you like. We could start off with the market for some sort of t-shirt or the market for a pint of beer. It doesn't really matter. Imagine though that you want this item, but you are dictated by your own income, your own financial ability to buy this item. Now, what happens when the price of this item goes up? Well, typically that would mean that you won't buy as much of this item. So one point on the demand function that you can kind of expect would be points that are high price, low quantities somewhere up here. Now, what happens when the price starts to drop? Then you're probably more likely to buy more of that item. And that would give you a point down here. Now, your demand function is going to be a smooth function taking you from points of high price, low quantity, points of low price, high quantity. And most basic function is a straight line, so we could use a linear function, but we could also use a quadratic function, exponential function, logarithmic functions, all kinds of different functions that we want to look at in this course. And so think about it as maybe being a curve and not just a straight line, but generally decreasing. So even though we may not have a line, we can talk about whether it's got sort of a negative slope. It's definitely going downwards to the right. Now, what about the producers of this product? We call that the supply function. Now, using the same kind of idea as before, we can have x being the quantity along the horizontal axis, b being the price along the vertical axis. Now, this time around, you have to think about yourself as being the producer of this product. And you will be dictated mostly by the fundamental drive to make more profit. And now, if your product is not valued highly and it's a very low price to get revenue in for this product, then you're probably not going to be much profit. It wouldn't be in your best interest to make very much of the product. And so one point that you can expect to see on a supply function is going to be low price, low quantity. However, if you're the manufacturer of this product and it's very desirable due to whatever circumstances or factors are out there in the market, if this is now a high priced product and you are the one who can make a lot of revenue off of that, and again, we're mostly talking about revenue, maybe your costs are still reasonable, but now suddenly it's a high priced item, then we can imagine being up here at the top right hand corner because a high price means you probably want to produce more of it. Okay, so now you can imagine either a straight line connecting from something bottom left to top right, or this could be something that is more gradually increasing as things go further to the right, in which case maybe you get a curve, that kind of idea. Could be a quadratic, could be exponential, logarithmic, whatever. But that would end up now being a supply curve that is generally increasing. Now the two pieces, the two components work together so that we don't end up with all products being high price, high quality, because nobody wants high price, high quantity. It's not going to work out well for the consumers who don't want to buy much at a high price. But you put these two pieces together. Okay, now it's probably time to color code these things a little bit. Why don't we take the demand function and let's make this blue so we can tell them apart. Let's put both of these on the same graph. We have our demand function. Let's say, well, it's got a P on the vertical axis and X on the horizontal axis. So this would make sense if we labeled this price is equal to the demand function of X. And then we've got our supply function. So again, this is going to be price equals supply function of X. And now you can kind of see that the two pieces work together. If you want every product produced to then be sold to a consumer, you want to make sure that you're at the single point here where every item produced is sold. The supply function and demand functions coincide. And this is called the equilibrium point. There is a specific value of X, why don't we call it X with a little bar over the top, and this is going to be the equilibrium quantity. Now there's also going to be a specific price corresponding to that quantity, and we'll call that the equilibrium price. That gives us the two coordinates, X bar, P bar, of our equilibrium point. Now you might not see exactly the same notation in all textbooks, all courses. X bar and P bar are sort of my choice of notation. That's the equilibrium point. And so to find the equilibrium point, you can then take these two equations, P equals the supply function of X and P equals the demand function of X, and set them equal to each other. So to find the equilibrium point, it's a nice equation of one function equals the other. Now, depending on the functions, if these are both linear functions, then one linear function equal to another linear function is the most basic, easy case to solve, but just adding terms on both sides and isolating X. If these are both quadratic functions, then you may have to take all of the terms, move it to one side, have it equal to 0, and then you've got a standard quadratic equation. From there, you can factor or use the quadratic formula. You're doing some of those in class. Now, there's one other thing that I might mention just right now while we're looking at supply and demand, even though it may not be a topic that we're going to be looking at specifically as much. It's what happens if the price is, or sorry, what happens if the price or quantity is a little bit too high or too low. Just take a look at that quickly by looking at this graph. What happens if the price is, let's say, maybe a bit too high? So if you've got in green here a high price, what's going to happen? You can see that when the price is arbitrarily set too high above the equilibrium price, the quantity that is demanded is going to be less than the quantity supplied. What's going to happen? Suddenly the supply is more than demand. We call that an excess. That's a surplus. So you end up with a high price being a surplus. And what about if you have a low price? If the price is significantly lower than the equilibrium price, what is going to happen when we talk about consumers versus producers? Well, with a low price, I don't know, if we're still talking about pints of beer right now and suddenly you're telling me that it's cheaper than it normally is, cheaper than I was expecting, I'm probably going to want to buy more. I'm over here. I'm the demand function, and I want to buy a high quantity, but that's not a great price for the producer of that beer. It's not sustainable, so that can't be supplied in large quantities at that price. So if the quantity demanded is higher than the quantity supplied, now we're talking about a circumstance called shortage. So, of course, if you're taking more of a course in economics, then you can talk about this a lot more, and you can be looking at what happens in various circumstances. But generally speaking, that price wants to fall back towards equilibrium so that everything is going to be at the same quantity. Thus, you avoid shortage and surplus. So that's a little bit of extra information. Because this is really more of a math course, we're going to be looking at different types of functions. using those as models for supply and demand, and then we can find the equilibrium point. And that will be a little bit more challenging depending on the complexity of the two functions. So we'll take a look at those in future videos. Thanks for watching.